But anyway, welcome everybody I think this is the third of the behavioral breakdowns. My name is Julie Dirksen. Most people know me as the author of the book Design for How People Learn, but a few years ago, several years ago, I got really interested in behavioral science and how we could apply that to learning and development. And a few years ago, I did a book called Talk to the Elephant, Design Learning for Behavior Change, which is specifically looking at how do we bring some techniques from behavioral science and use them to really think about how do we help learners change the behaviors, the target behaviors that we're looking for in organizations and things like that. And what the behavioral breakdowns are is they're very much like a conversation. We'll have a few slides up front and explain a few things, but by and large, these are conversations, and we're specifically looking at the challenge of some really sort of tricky, interesting behaviors, and can we use behavioral science to kind of shed a bit of a light on this? The person I'm talking to today is Dr. Ingeborg Kroese. How's my pronunciation?
Very good.
Okay, cool. Yay. And we met at a conference last year in Belgium, and had some interesting conversations around the challenges of really kind of inclusive learning and some of those kinds of things. And this has been an interesting conversation for me for many years because I see a lot happening in this space that's very focused on things like awareness or mindset. And, I think one of the challenges that people have when they're applying it is how do I actually translate this into practice? What should I actually be doing? And the answer to that is always complicated because the answer is, well, it sort of depends. It depends on your audience, it depends on your context, it depends on a lot of things. And so trying to figure out some ways to make some of these things a little bit more concrete for people, that's largely what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to let Ingeborg share her slides and tell you a little bit about kind of what she's been working and where she's coming from and what she's working on. And then we'll get started with the conversation.
All right. Well, okay, let me start by saying, Julie, that I'm super excited to be in this conversation. I think inclusive learning is an area that we as learning and development have great opportunities for and in. And I think having the conversation around what does that mean in terms of real behaviors is really helpful to move us forward. So really appreciate the time and the opportunity. So just to share a couple of slides just to get us started on the topic of inclusive learning. Can I just check the slides are okay,
Yep,
visible?
yep,
It's
they look good.
excellent. Okay, so this is around our conversation is going to be around behaviors to create inclusive learning. And before we do that, I think it's good to define what we mean by inclusive learning. So inclusive learning means that our learning programs, but also our conferences and other initiatives that we have, work successfully for all our learners, irrespective of gender, race, ethnicity, disability, class, neurodivergent, age, so categories of difference. So that's what we want to achieve when we talk about inclusive learning. And you may ask, how did I get into this space? Why has it become such a passion for me? And just to give you a little bit of background on how I came into this, into the topic of inclusive learning. So my background is I started in an international corporate career, commercial career, long time ago. Then a global learning and development for the last, I would say, about 20 years. I've been designing and facilitating learning and development around the globe. And for the last 10 years or so, I have re-entered academia and I'm a researcher on inclusive learning. And what happened was, and why did I get into this space, is this is our son with Down syndrome, who was born 21 years ago now in Dubai, in the Middle East. And when he was about 12, 13, I realized that in my conversations with schools and with educators, I felt that I didn't have the knowledge and the skills to really support him in his education and ensure that he was included in schools and in education. So I did a master in critical issues in education in the UK. And in that master studies and the literature and the research, there were all these questions asked about, who is seen in education, who is included in education, who has the opportunity to succeed. And it made me realize that, at least in my experience, we didn't necessarily ask these type of questions in learning and development, in organizations and in companies. And I was thinking, well, is that okay? Are we missing things? Are we really including all our learners? So that was basically the start of my journey, looking into how does inclusiveness and including all our learners work in learning and development, basically my own practice. And that was actually further reinforced. This is my son with Down syndrome with this older brother who also wanted to be in the slide. But these are my two daughters. And they were born in different parts of the world. And their lived experiences in life, in general, but also in education and schools, is very different. And that kind of reinforced for me the need to have a look at inclusion, who's included, who has the opportunity to succeed, and what are those lived experiences of our learners. So it's very much started as a personal story, reinforced by a personal story. But that was why, well, basically I started in this research, have been publishing, researching on inclusive learning, and now work with many learning and development teams to help them make their programs more equitable and inclusive. So what we did before when you registered for today's session, we asked a couple of questions. And I wanted to share with you what the results were of the questions that we asked. And the first question we asked was, how well do your learning programs enable all your learners to participate fully without facing barriers that make learning especially difficult or less effective? And 37% said, well, not enough. 58% said reasonably well. And 5% said, if it wants to show, our learning programs are designed to be fully inclusive. So, and this I would say is resonates with other polls that we've done and other research that has been done on this. So I think we ourselves would say that we have some work to do in terms of making sure that our learning is inclusive and our learners are not facing any barriers. And then when we looked at ourselves, so the question was, do you and your learning team members have the knowledge and skills to create inclusive learning? 11% said, no, we have much more to learn. Many of us said, well, we know some, but we need to learn more. And 12% of says, well, yes, we have sufficient knowledge and skills. And then we had another category, and that category says, yes, we have the knowledge and skills, but we face barriers. So one of the things that we hope is going to happen in our conversation today is that we can also learn and pull you into our conversation to see how we can maybe learn and listen to your experiences, the behaviors that you have seen work well to make our learning more successful and inclusive. So we're hoping to learn from you, but I think we ourselves are saying as a community that there's some work to be done and some skills to be developed. So looking forward to that. If I dive a little bit deeper into inclusive learning, what I think that means in terms of what we do in the different stages of learning. As a foundation, I think it means that we as learning and development professionals want to be aware of what that means in terms of inclusive learning, being reflexive on asking ourselves how our own realities and beliefs and values impact the learning that we organize, and be intentional about being inclusive in our learning. In our needs analysis, I think we need to be curious about what's going on. We need to be critical what is happening in terms of the structures and the equities and the equalities that are out there, and sensitive about the lives and the experiences of our different learners. If we look at the design, we want to make sure that our designs are accessible, that they're inclusive, and that they're equitable. If we look at our facilitation, I think it's important that we are safe and that our facilitation is adaptive to different needs and circumstances, and that in our facilitation we embrace diversity. And I'll have some examples of that later on. And finally, in our evaluation, I think that evaluation, if you look at inclusiveness, needs to be meaningful and asking for how inclusive our learning is, purposeful, and definitely action oriented. And then when I had my conversations with Julie challenged me and said, yeah, but this is all good and well, but what does that mean in terms of what do we actually do, which is something that we really want to further explore in our conversation today. And I have some examples, but this is definitely not everything. And when we go and dive into this a little bit deeper, then I'm sure there's other things coming out. But if you look at that foundation where I think we need to be aware, reflexive, and intentional, it is, for example, taking deliberate steps to understand inclusive learning and what inclusive learning is all about. It is reflexivity, considering whether our own experiences and values impact our program designs. And it's really being intentional about that inclusion part of the program. Needs analysis, being curious, critical, and sensitive. So that means we actively explore what those different perspectives and needs are from a diverse group of learners. We need to make an effort to learn about norms and dominant behaviors and explore how these affect the different learners. And when we talk about these things, we really have to be sensitive and thoughtful and care about experiences of others. So some of the behaviors, again, there's probably many more, but these are just to give you an example. If we look at design, offer multiple ways to access content and opportunities to participate. Reflect those different perspectives and experiences in our designs, not the one size fits all approach that I come across quite a lot in learning and development programs. And then develop and pilot designs with a diverse group of learners and users. So co-creation is something that, in terms of behaviors, fits really well in terms of inclusive learning. Facilitation, safe, adaptive, embrace diversity. What does that mean? It means setting ground rules, for example, as a behavior to make sure that there is respect and safety and understanding. It means that you build in your facilitation structures to make sure that contributions are equally valued. For example, using liberating structures in your facilitation. And invite those different perspectives and experiences to build on your models and frameworks to really invite those different lived experiences. And finally, evaluation, meaningful, purposeful, and action-oriented. For example, really asking how inclusive the learning was. And I've given a link here to questions that you can use to ask how inclusive the learning was. Segregate your evaluation data to understand whether different groups have different feedback for you about the program. And another one is run cohort analysis to understand whether the program was experienced differently and works differently for different audiences. So just to give you a very quick feel for inclusive learning and some of the ideas, the behaviors. But with that, handing over to Julie again, do some real behavior breakdown and see how we can make this real and create some change. So
Yeah.
starting.
All right. Fantastic. So the rest of this really is very much a conversation. So if people haven't been to one of these before, that's kind of the end of the presentation piece. And now we're
Yeah.
going to have a conversation. By the way, I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but if anybody would like to speak up or ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Otherwise, feel free to comment or participate in the chat. And I will do my best to keep an eye on questions or comments in the chat. Leah, our producer, will also kind of be keeping an eye on the chat. So if there's anything that you would like to, thoughts you'd like to share or questions you'd like to ask, please feel free. It really is intended to be kind of a conversation. So Ingeborg, I will tell you there's two behaviors that really jumped out at me. I think that are very interesting from a conversational point of view. And the way that the behavioral breakdowns work is the main framework that I use for these things is something that's referred to as the COM-B or the behavior change wheel. But COM-B basically sort of asks the question, are people capable of doing the behavior? Do they have the opportunity, both socially or in terms of their environment, of doing the behavior? And are they motivated to do the behavior? And where are the gaps in that? Like if they know all about it, why is it still not happening? Some of those kinds of things. So the two behaviors that jumped out at me, and I'm happy to take either one. One is we've had a little bit of a conversation around the reflexivity piece, and I think that that one's super interesting because obviously one of the challenges with all of this is that it's kind of fraught with there are abundant blind spots for all of us, right? Nobody can have a perfect view of what inclusivity is in the world. And obviously you've spent a really long time and a lot of like effort in terms of degrees and academic research to understand this. But even I think even you would sort of acknowledge that like you can't 100% know everything that everybody's perspective has. So like how do we manage that? And the other one that I think is really interesting is that co-creation piece, because I think that that is super important and yet harder than maybe not that we give it credit for, but harder than it maybe sounds on the surface and things like that. Is there a particular one you would like to start with?
I think reflexivity is probably a really good one to
Yeah.
start with because you're right. I think a lot of this work, let's call it work, that we need to do on making our learning and development programs more inclusive starts with ourselves
Yeah.
as learning and development professionals.
Hmm.
And and what I see or what may happen is that we think, well, if a program works for us, it works for everybody. And if
Hmm.
there's no complaints, then there's no issues. So the
Right.
challenge is how do we get out of that, and how do we understand what those lived experiences are for others?
Hmm.
Especially, I guess, if we're privileged. Let's bring in the word privilege, and
Hmm.
because the privilege, as is often said, the privilege of the privileged is not to know they're privileged. So
Right.
it's difficult to know. So it's often unseen. You don't recognize it, and um, what it means is that we really have to get out there and, for one, kind of accept the fact that our world is not the only world, our experiences are not the only experiences, and our learners may have different experiences than our own and different lived realities. And to understand what that looks like, I think there are so many resources already in terms of online, in terms of books, in terms of articles, in terms of lots of these kind of resources that can help us get a different perspective on what else is happening out there, and where does diversity of experience show up.
Hmm.
So I think so it starts with us, and sometimes we have the tendency to say, yeah, no, let's go out and let's go and talk to all these diverse learners and see what their experiences are. But in a sense, I think we do have to take our own, do our own homework first before
Hmm.
we go and do that. So that means one is, being understanding what it means in terms of inclusive learning, and then educating ourselves with the abundance of resources that are out there to understand what those perspectives could be in different lived experiences.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because if we look at the capability piece, right? Like one of the things that's sort of inherent, and I think, you know, nobody's a bad person because they have blind spots. Like that's the human condition, right? Like we all have them.
Yeah.
And so what we're really looking for when we're looking for kind of a concrete behavior here, and I think you've identified one, which is right, like go and do the research. Although we still have the challenge of what research is the right research or what research is enough research and things like that. And I
Yeah.
think that's a challenge. I did some work many years ago for with some doctors who were doing material on kind of cross-cultural communication in healthcare. And they were talking about the issue of kind of they were what they referred to as the exotics model, which was like, oh, I have a patient from Somalia, or I have a patient from Myanmar, or, wherever. I will research, like what cultural issues may crop up. And they're like, that's fine. Like you're certainly welcome to do that, but you can't carry around, knowledge of every single culture's, quirks, sorry, bad word, characteristics when it comes to, reactions to medical care. Like that's just not possible. And so they really emphasize kind of a method of inquiry, right? So really having this thing where you're asking good questions to make sure that you understand what mindset and what understanding the patient is bringing to the room, and that you're, kind of asking them how they understand their own illness and what their perspective is on treatment, and treating the whole process of um treating the whole process of prescribing as a negotiation to make sure that we, both parties are kind of on board with what the plan is and things like that. And so that always struck me as kind of a useful frame. So for something like this, you know, so okay, we can say, hey, there's a bunch of resources in the world, go out and, look at them, which certainly improves, I think, capability for people. It does raise the issue of like, what's enough if you're being a responsible, human in this scenario, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, and it's very fair. And the one thing that you brought up or that you reminded me of is um, I think there's a shift that we need to make in this work from um, wondering how we can help or how we can include women, or how can we include people from the next generation, or how can we include people with an impairment, or to thinking around how come that our learning and development programs are often based on a default learner,
mhm,
and that default learner doesn't necessarily reflect either any of our learners, or it's not a very inclusive concept because it's very often based on a dominant, maybe historically dominant person who was in
mhm,
that learning and development program. So the shift in perspective to, how can we move away from that we have a default learner to understanding that there's this difference in the room is one that is, I think, is really important. That then also changes the question. So if you would then go out there and for example, do your research, you wouldn't necessarily put in whatever search systems you use as to, how does, I'm just saying, let's say you talk about a negotiation program or a communication program or another skills program. How does a category, for example, gender, show up in negotiations? But you would search for, or the question that you put in is, how does inequality show up in,
mhm,
for example, negotiations or communications? Because then you get an understanding of, hey, what could be those different lived experiences without moving into stereotypical thinking, which is, I think, something that your doctors also, maybe was in the back of their minds, is, how do you then go and say all this diversity that's out there, how do I really understand what's working? How can I do that for all different types of diversity? But if you go one level deeper and you ask,
mhm,
how does inequality, inequity show up? You
mhm,
suddenly get a better understanding of, hey, what are some of the dilemmas, the realities that my learners may experience.
Hmm. Yeah. There's a comment from Catherine about developing thoughtful personas would be really helpful activity to pair with reflexivity. And I think that's absolutely true. There's a Indy Young, who's kind of one of, I think, the primary people behind conversations around personas and things like that, had some interesting stuff around not putting, like, not attaching pictures to personas, or not putting a gender in personas, or not necessarily putting an age in personas, because I think, to her point, the real purpose behind personas is to relate, and she comes from a user experience, not a learning background, but is related to what their story is and what their needs are, and some of those kinds of things. And that when we do attach a gender, or an age, or a photo that maybe shows race or something like that to these, we start to bring our own kind of assumptions to the table. And so I kind of hear one thing, which is there's sort of a base level of kind of knowledge and research that you should be doing. I like what you're saying around specifically the question of kind of how does inequality show up for this. And that seems like that's an interesting one. I'm still a little bit of an AI skeptic, Luddite, whatever, but that is actually a prompt or a question, that we could feed into these. Obviously, you'd want to validate it and, check it, because we know that bias shows up in those too. But it's a nice way of kind of framing it that can specifically give you like some pointers or some directions of things that you can look for. So if we were to say that again so that we can maybe capture it in the chat. If How does inequality show up in the context of,
Yeah,
or how would you phrase it?
yeah. So how would inequity? So I would
Inequity, thank you.
longer conversation on equality and equity, but how would inequity show up in the topic of what you're going to discuss in your program? So that
Yep.
can be
Mm,
skill or communication or leadership or something, and that then gives that can give really good pointers in terms of, okay, what can those different realities be, that you can then have a conversation around with
mhm.
a diverse group of learners.
Right.
But
Right.
that's I think, a different approach than going to a diverse group of learners and asking them, what's your experience?
Hmm.
That is not the behavior that I think we should do.
Hmm. So there's a capability issue, right? Of just a certain kind of base knowledge, and just sort of acknowledging that nobody's knowledge of how this stuff impacts all, different types of learners is going to be comprehensive, because there's no such thing, but there's still kind of a base level that we would look at, and then specifically investigating the topic of the training and asking this question about how does inequity show up, and again, maybe the AI can help us, maybe just searching can show us, but those kinds of things. And I mean, there's always going to be some stuff where maybe there's no answer kind of out there in the world because of the specific nature of a particular topic, but there could be a lot of things. I'm thinking of, you mentioned negotiation, and that's such a good one, because the I wrote a piece years and years ago about my frustration with, and I think the conversation has shifted on it, but with using things like um, the advice we used to get about fixing like a gender pay gap almost always involved women negotiating harder, and I was just like, hang on. And I mean, I think the research has borne out the fact that, if women negotiated the same way that men did, they don't necessarily get the same results, which, fundamentally sort of suggests that there's kind of an underlying issue there. But it does mean if you're putting together a negotiation curriculum, there are a lot of power dynamics that you would want to be aware of, and a lot of issues that sort of crop up. So it feels a little bit like, I mean, we've sort of talked about reflexivity as something that you're doing almost internally, like asking about your own biases, but by definition, the behavior still involves kind of looking out too, if you know what I mean. Like, you can't possibly just sort of sit there and think hard about where are my blind spots. So,
No, that absolutely, and I think, and it almost goes almost like hand in hand, right? It almost goes hand in hand in terms of what we call looking at your own positionality. So really having a look at, hey, what kind of values do I bring? What's my background? What did I get? Coming back to some of the privilege, what did I have? What did I get? And how does that impact how I see the world and how I go through life? And then when you, for example, use the prompt that we just discussed, and you read about stuff that impact how people's positionality and experiences can be different, that gives you then the opportunity to self-reflect and say, maybe, you know, my world is not the entire world. So I think the internal and the external kind of goes hand in hand. And I think
Mhm.
the key point that I think in terms of behaviors that is important is, you know, we need to do some of our own homework first before we go
Mhm.
out to our diverse learners,
Yeah.
because that's our job. It's
Yeah.
hard.
So when we look at the C in the combi, the capability, there does seem to be, like a baseline that we need to understand, right? Like there's some basic uh the some basic knowledge we need to,
Yeah.
that we're responsible. It's that sort of do your own homework piece. And then above that, there's the ability to kind of research the specific topic. There's also, in the combi, the opportunity one, there's like the social space of, do you have social support for this? Are you seeing the behavior modeled in others? And I think there's always some opportunity there around people kind of doing show their work on these things. And kind of understanding what other people are doing. By the way, we would love to hear if there's anything in particular any of you are doing in your organizations or anything that you found to be really useful for any of this. Please share. I know I can see there's a long note from Lee that I will get to as soon as I can, divide my attention enough. But yeah, we're super curious about what everybody else is doing in this space. So we've got this baseline capability, and then we've got the ability to kind of investigate. So there's sort of two capabilities there, right? One is just my knowledge of, I've done my reasonable research. I've been reading up on this issue, things like that. And then there's this sort of ability to kind of ask the question and investigate it a little bit. There's then opportunity. One of the other opportunity pieces that, of course, always comes up and is just a reality of kind of our modern world, which is people having enough time to do some of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that kind of is adjacent to the motivation issue. One of the things around motivation that we always look at is incentives. So we can have very good, attitudes towards doing this stuff, but there also has to be some, some incentive, that is like it's the right thing to do is an incentive, but what else is there when we start to look at, what's the motivation for people to do this?
To do this, yeah. And just to pick up on that time, I think the time issue comes up on two fronts. I think the time issue comes up in our own time as learning and development professionals and designers. Where do we find the time to do this work?
Mhm.
But it shows up in the time squeeze that we often, or well, that I see often happens in our programs, where we have to deliver really big content and learning objectives in a 2-hour online course, because
Yeah.
that's about the efficiency and the effectiveness thinking. So, and that doesn't necessarily help us have an inclusive lens, because how do you then invite diverse voices, and how do you then have a conversation around how the models and frameworks that we use may be expanded by different experiences. So I think time, to your point, is a real challenge. And I think the motivation that I see for people who do this work, and for leadership and learning and development leaders to support this work, which is
Hmm.
really, really important, is I think there is an ethical reason why people
Hmm.
people who do this work do it, because they feel it's the right thing to do, and they want to be part of making our workplaces and our learning and development programs fairer. So that's one rationale. many of the people do it because this is basically also about great learning.
Hmm.
Many of the things that we discuss, it's not just for, as we said in the beginning, including specific groups, but it's making sure that we move away from this default learner that really wasn't attractive or relevant for many of our learners. So a lot of the things that we are talking about here in terms of more inclusive learning actually makes the learning a lot better for all our learners. So, and that's a really important one to remember.
Hmm.
Other people do it because they or their organizations have clear objectives and strategies for diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, and they want to make sure that their learning and development actually supports reaching those objectives instead of
Hmm.
hampering those objectives. So that's another reason. And finally, I think if you look at the return on investment on learning programs, it's very difficult to maximize that if you're not including parts of your learners. So there's different perspectives on the motivation I think that
Hmm.
people have for doing this work. To your point in the beginning, depends on your context, dependent on your opportunities, your resources. But
Yeah. Well, the if we do the base, if we kind of establish this baseline research, then that informs kind of all the programs we develop. So the cost isn't borne by like a particular project or something like that. So that's certainly an argument. And then also it's cheaper to, it's got to be cheaper to do a lot of stuff right from the beginning than it is to fix
oh,
things after,
absolutely.
after complaints or a lawsuit or an issue pops up or things like that. That's presumably got to be one of the the arguments within the organization, like, hey, if we just do this right, like it's so much less expensive than fixing things that we get wrong.
Oh, and that's absolutely fantastic motivation, and that is still some of the I think the things that may happen now is that there's a design of a program, and then there the question becomes, how can we make sure that these different groups of people can be included, and that is it's I mean it's just really intense and a loss of resources, I would say, to do it that way. Whereas if we already start with the idea, let go of the one size fits all default learner, then it saves a lot of time and effort and cost later on in the process. So yeah, so design for diversity and inclusiveness from the start, which I think brings us nicely into the co-creation
Yeah.
creation topic.
Yes, let's absolutely talk about that because I think that's what's so interesting. And I speak to this one a little bit personally because obviously we know that there's kind of a, the sort of rallying cry from a lot of these communities is nothing for us without us, right? Like the idea that a lot of this stuff has happened without the inclusion of some of these communities, and that promotes a lot of issues. But then, the co-creation piece, I think, also feels really challenging to people. So what capabilities would people need to have in order to be able to like effectively leverage this idea of kind of co-creation? Because I think if you suggested to everybody, like, you need to have, you need to have learners who are representative of every possible, kind of combination of things participating in the design of this, like literally having a seat at the table, I think that would feel really overwhelming to people. So what can this look like in a way that's, I guess, feasible?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think so I think there's different things that you can look at. One is there are, we started with doing some of your own research, right? So
Mhm.
some of your understanding where some of the pain points are and what some of those different lived realities are. If you talk about, um, sorry, Lee is doing all this fantastic stuff in the chat. Anyway, so you can either ask a lot of people, diverse people on forehand to really be part of it and co-create it, or what you can do as part of your design is you leave space as your design in your design to have conversations and be curious about bringing in lived experiences and how that can build on a model that you have. So you can also, and that's where the facilitation, for example, is really important, and have those facilitation skills is when, for example, to your point, you have those 5 steps of negotiations without any consideration of, gendered stereotypical norms and expectations. You can have a conversation about power and about norms and stereotypes as part of your program, and then in your facilitation have a conversation about, so what does that mean? How does that actually expand the model? How can we further build on this model? So that's, I think, part of where co-creation means giving people the opportunity also during the design and during the facilitation to bring in some of their experiences. So I think that's one that's really important. And I think if you look at some of the other parts of co-creation is, you really want to understand where some of these pain points are and where some of these lived experiences show up, and then invite those different learners to share their experiences with you. So you can, for example, bring them in your activities, in your some of the theories, some of the frameworks that you include. So, and again, I would almost say, but that's what we typically do in learning and development. But now you're really conscious about the fact that you want to include all these different perspectives. Does that
Mhm.
help?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is it's not possible to include like literally all of the potential perspectives in terms of, just the amount of time that it takes and the things. So I guess the question is what's a reasonable balance for this? I in I follow a lot of stuff around writing and publishing and things like that. And there's a concept that's been showing up a lot, which is the idea of like a sensitivity reader for books, right? So if you have a deaf character in one of your books, you would then have one or more, deaf sensitivity readers. And so these would be people from the population who would read it and give you feedback on, yes, this is realistic. No, this doesn't make sense, that kind of thing. And that's kind of the due diligence around that. A friend of mine is a user experience person, and she was working for a large online retailer, like electronics retailer, and did an enormous amount of work on trying to make sure that they would have screeners that they would use with agencies to get people to test the website or to come in and be using, do user testing on the website. And so really trying to make sure that the screener that they were using to select, audiences for the screening of this website were genuinely reflective of the diversity that was in their audience. And obviously, it seems like, again, there's sort of probably tiers of there's like diversity and inclusion that you know for a fact is present in your audience, right?
Yeah.
So at a minimum, that you've got, gender diversity, or you've got some ethnicity diversity, or you've got non-native English speakers in an English speaking core, who are going to be using an English speaking resource, or, like different kinds of things. And so, is that an unfortunate compromise to kind of lean into the diversity that is present in your audience versus trying to like, but that's going to come with its own set of blind spots and things like that. And
Yeah.
so I think getting an exact right answer is, not ever going to happen. But is there something that we can sort of say, if we take these strategies, we're fairly confident that we're at least meeting the needs of, this part of our audience, and then we still want to have some methods for making sure that we're figuring out how to not be um how to not ignore some other possibilities.
Yeah. No, and that, yeah. So I think so that's a strategy that you can follow. So
Mhm.
there's the different categories, the big categories that come to mind when we talk about diversity. The challenge, I think, as you mentioned, is that you have to be careful about the stereotypes that come with that, and how do you
Mhm.
then really make sure that you include, you know, all the diversity that's out there. That's your challenge. So I think there is some, I mean, having a testing, somebody groups test your designs, making sure that there is sensitivity to, you know, some of the things that you described is really important. But the other thing I would say is that a lot of the difference in lived experiences and challenges, if you talk about inequality and inequity, have a very similar base. So the foundation of some of those experiences is similar to a point that they often come down to norms, stereotypes, different types of power relations. So if you're able to bring that into start some of your co-creation with thinking around, okay, so how do these things that underlie some of these different lived experiences that they have nothing to do with biology, but they're because of the social world that we live in that has
Yeah.
caused some of this inequality. So how do I, and that's why I think the question that we came up with in terms of putting that out there and getting some input on how does equality show up, that equality that shows up then relates often both to gender as well to ethnicity as well as to different ages dependent on, you know, where what is the program that you look at. So it's kind of going that level deeper, and then asking people to come in and say, hey, I want to build in some of these underlying dynamics of how do we treat stereotypes in negotiations, how do we deal with different power relations in negotiations. Then I think you start to make programs that are really inclusive by design for so many different categories than just the big categories that we typically default to.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and Eileen's got the comment about the universal design as being something that kind of, you know, has that designing for all and not a smaller population of people. And so yeah, the approach is I'm I'm trying to I was thinking about like, you know, we talk about this sort of default learner, and I was
Yeah,
wondering if it might make sense to actually go through the process of saying this is the default learner that we're all picturing in our heads. Now let's look at, you know, all of the characteristics we listed that are attached to this default learner, like education, age, and, you know, like what they, you know, it could be race, it could be gender, it could be any of these kinds of things, and going, okay, so what perspectives might we be missing if we're only, you know, um, if we're only, you know, talking, if we're only kind of picturing this person when we're doing it. So sort of the kind of reverse analysis against, you know, okay, if we think about our defaults, you know, they're college educated, are they a native English speaker, they're, you know, whatever the set of things are. Okay, well, what if they weren't, you know, for each of these characteristics, who would we
yeah,
need to include in order to have something, you know, some kind of perspective? I can see that there's probably some pitfalls to that approach, but it's, you know, um, the,
yeah.
you know, yeah.
And it's a fantastic question to ask, and it also comes back to the previous work on personas. It's to ask that
Hmm.
what if question. You know, what if?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I know an example of a participant in one of my programs said, you know, what I do is when I do a role play, I switch roles. So, for example, I'm making this up, but negotiation training. I have two roles in the negotiation training, and then I bring in the role play, I bring in gender. So I put two different genders, or I bring in ethnicity. And then we have a conversation with the participants in the program. How does that change the dynamics of the conversation?
Hmm.
I think the what if question is really helpful to get a different perspective if you understand what that means in terms of how gender impacts lived experiences and ethnicity and neurodivergence. But I think I want to get us back to in to really thinking around not just the category and then the risk of stereotypical thinking, but how is what we have created really how does that reflect an environment that is maybe made and developed for as I said, that default learner and that default participant. So I really would like us to move away from that, the risk of being stereotypical and thinking around the norms and some of those underlying challenges that we have.
Mhm.
Um, so that I think is understanding how that works, how, for example, asking the question of how are things done in our company? What is kind of the norm of the behavior? What is the expectation in terms of the behavior? How is negotiations done? And then wondering, okay, so what does that mean for people who are maybe different? How does that impact maybe how you're experiencing, some of our processes or, for example, the negotiations?
Mhm. So when we talk about co-creation, like what does, let's say it's a training program, we'll go ahead and keep using our negotiation example. If you were genuinely doing co-creation, for a training program on negotiation for an organization, let's say, large corporate entity of some kind, what would the actual, again, like this sort of issue of what are the actual behaviors, like what could it, granted there's no single right answer probably, but what could that look like in terms of actual things that, here I am, I've been tasked, the stakeholders have handed the responsibility for creating this negotiation training. I want to do the best I can and to creating one that's inclusive. You talked about the specific of like changing up the role play, right? Like here's a
Yes.
standard role play and I'm going to consider those. So that's one possibility. And having those conversations. But what else should I be doing around co-creation? Like
Yeah.
I'm doing my project planning, I'm sitting down, I'm kind of,
You
like
have to start with.
identifying stakeholders and resources and, who I need to include in like the needs analysis or the design phase and things like that. So what am I
Yeah.
doing?
Okay, so I would start with what we've been discussing in the beginning. I would start with looking up how different lived experiences, inequity show up in negotiations. So then I have a really good feel for, what does that mean in terms of positionalities, categories, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would with that information, I would reach out and I would say, okay, so who are my, what are my learners? Where can I find a diverse group of learners? And I would have a conversation with them saying, okay, so what is, how are negotiations typically happening in our company? What are the expectations? What does that mean for you? How does that impact you? I'm reading these kind of things around negotiations and how people may experience that differently. You get these stories, and then what you do is you bring those stories into your program. For example, with different role plays. For
Mhm.
example, with putting up your framework and then asking people to enrich your framework by bringing in those different experiences. So you really want to open up the space for people to share what they experience, which also then means what they need to come out of the program to be successful. And you need to intentionally build that into that program. So it's basically that start with us in your needs analysis, be sensitive, critical, aware, and then in your program making sure that you build that in.
Mhm. So potentially one way to do it is to have those conversations with people up front. Do you also see when we talk about co-creation, do you also see them literally, kind of at the table as we're doing design work or
Absolutely. So you
Mhm.
you invite this different, you invite learners in, and I think you know i- diversity is everywhere, right? We're all very diverse. So
Mhm.
you have to be very careful with not being very stereotypical around, okay, people will have certain experiences because they have a certain identity or background, but you have to be very intentional about finding um, um, different subject matter experts, different learners from different parts of the world with different backgrounds, and invite them in really early on in the process to to help you with understanding what's happening and move away from that one size fits all. And I've seen people having, for example, groups of learners that they know they can ask to come in terms of a design process, to help get some of these different lived experiences. I've seen learning and development professionals go to their employee research groups and say, "No, we're working on this program. Can you help us with understanding some of what you're experiencing in this field of learning? How can we make sure that this learning is accessible and reflects your needs?" So um, it is it is inviting, intentionally inviting these different perspectives to come in, and then co-create in terms of how are we then organizing that learning to reflect that.
Mhm. So obviously it's having conversations with diverse learners around the topic and their experience within the organization. What is the sort of feeling of, I I don't necessarily have a big representation of a particular characteristic in my, my audience. So for example, this is training for by basically, people who are new to the field, so for the vast majority of them, the training is, they're going to be fairly young, maybe they're, right out of school or something like that. And so we know that we're, the vast majority of the people that were coming in are going to be in a particular age range. It's not impossible that I could have a, more mature student who, is career switching or something, like, is there, like, obviously in our ideal world, we would still talk to, somebody from an outlier, population, but we're back to that time issue again, right? We're back to the realities of, I can't do 87 interviews necessarily for a course, that kind
Mm,
of thing.
mm.
So is there any sense of that in terms of, the idea of like prioritization sort of feels like it's inherently fighting with inclusion. Do you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, yeah. And I think, I mean, some what's very often said, and I think that's also a realistic approach here, is a progress over perfection,
Hmm.
right? And I think in one of the books that I read recently, it said the issue is not necessarily that not all our programs are inclusive, because this is a topic that has come really to the forefront fairly recently. But the challenge is more if we don't work on it at all, right? If we
Hmm.
don't see this as something. So we should give ourselves some space to get into this work and do this work and learn how to do this work. So that I think in terms of priorities is definitely a fair point. Now, the thing is that I think if you say, listen, my group is currently not very diverse, that may be an issue in itself, right?
Right, right, right. Yeah.
Because it may be that the way that you've organized the program is actually, as a result of that, you don't have a lot of diversity, and that's what we see in terms of accessibility in many cases, right? In terms
Hmm.
of entry requirements that basically confirm who has already been participating in this program for many many years. So we basically keep that same in the same audience coming as part of our entry requirements or our cost or our timing. Or so if you don't have a very diverse audience, that could be a potential red flag to
Hmm.
consider.
Yeah. Hey, I'm so sorry, people. The top of the hour totally snuck up on me. So we are past we're past the 1 hour mark. I think Ingeborg and I are gonna stay for a few minutes and kind of wrap this conversation up. But if anybody needs to drop off, totally understand. We will send out a link to the recording, um, as a follow-up for everyone who registered. Um, uh, I think let's take a few minutes to wrap up the conversation. But is there anything? Where can people find you? And is there anything that you would really love people to take a look at before we lose people to the next? We probably already
To
are,
the
but
tape. Okay,
Yeah.
so yes, I would love to, if people are interested in what I'm trying to do in my research and some of my key findings, then LinkedIn is a great place to connect because I really try to be very open about what I find and share as much as I can in terms of learnings. My website, Enhanced Facilitation, has all my publications. Please reach out if you want to get into this work and uh, get into all the practicalities of what we've learned. I really appreciate that. Can make some change happening.
Yeah, and I think we'll, like I said, we'll still wrap up this conversation, but just for people, we'll send out links to Ingeborg's LinkedIn and also to the survey that you worked on with Will Tallheimer about kind of a post survey for
Yeah,
inclusion, kind of assessing the inclusivity of the your learning materials. There's a survey that you and Will have made available to do that. For my own purposes, I'm at usablelearning.com. If you'd like to have additional conversations about designing for behavior change and specifically how to, kind of analyze to really dig into the root causes of some tricky behavior changes, I'll send my website in the follow-up as well. And also Talk to the Elephant Design Learning for Behavior Change is available. And in the follow-up email, I'll add a coupon code for that if anybody would like a discount on buying it. But if you'd like to dig into that issue a little bit more. And so just to kind of wrap up some of the things that have kind of been rolling in my head, like obviously I keep kind of trying to drive towards what should people be doing? Should they be conducting
yeah,
interviews? Should be and what I think the answer, not the answer, but the direction that I do see on this is that we're probably looking at behaviors that need to exist at like the individual project level, but then also some underlying behaviors that need to exist in maybe the department level or the organization level or the system level. And so that might be an interesting conversation for us to have some time of like, what's the foundation that should exist in order to, best kind of support this? Then, what do we think what should be happening, you know, sort of within a learning and development department, what should be happening within an individual project? Because some of this stuff is just, I'll be honest, out of scope for individual projects, but it should still happen. And so that needs to be something that needs to be like budgeted for, or time allocated for, or resources attached to kind of, and it is that piece, right? Like if we do this upfront work, everything else works much better and everything else flows much
absolutely.
better and
Yeah,
all of those kinds of things. And so that kind of and it suggests maybe maturity models or, something along those lines of like, how do we work towards getting to the place where this is just because I've had conversations with, other people who work in this space and they're like, it should just be part of design right at the beginning. It shouldn't be, oh, we designed it. Now how do we make sure that like, screen readers can access it or things like that? and
absolutely.
and the
Yeah,
limitations of kind of just a checklist approach, but I think there's something there around, and I'm sure some other people have already figured this out and are doing great jobs with it. One other thing I'll mention is we'll make sure that we include the chat in a link to the chat transcript in the things because so many people have been putting phenomenal resources and useful information in there. So we'll make sure that that's part of what we send out after the fact as well.
great.
Um, I'm so sorry. We needed more time. We should
So
have
fun.
we should
Yeah,
have
and I
scheduled
mean, and
more.
there's so much more. And I think some of the things that we're also we haven't discussed, but is also important, is that accessibility, inclusivity, and
Mhm.
that sometimes also so accessibility is to make sure that all the barriers, there's no barriers for participation, but then inclusiveness is around making sure that all those different voices and experiences are heard. And equity then becomes people have very the same chances of being successful in the program. So I think that's another level that we could potentially kind of unpack a little bit to talk about. So there's lots more to talk about
Yeah, well, we'll
around
do
the
some
topic.
follow-ups. We'll
We'll do
we'll
some
we'll
follow-up.
schedule some
Yeah,
out and we could,
absolutely, absolutely.
um thanks to everybody for all of that fabulous participation and in particular the people who are sharing all their great resources in the chat conversation. And yeah, I I want to keep going, but I know everybody's got to move on with their day. So,
That's a hard
um,
one to let go of, right? This,
yeah.
yeah.
All right. Thanks everybody. And Mark, we'll try to get that. Hopefully we'll get this out fairly quickly and we can get that link. How long is your survey thing up?
2 more days.
2 more days. Okay. Well, we'll do what we can.
It's okay.
I don't know if
That's
I don't
okay.
know if the I don't know if the follow-up recording's going out until maybe tomorrow
No,
or something,
no worries. No worries.
but okay.
But thank you. All right.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Well, thank you so much for everybody for joining us, and thank you so much, Ingeborg. And like I said, I think we've got part 2 and 3 we'll have to do. We'll have to figure out when we're going to do this.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that. Thank you
So.
so much. Thanks everybody for joining and being part of this conversation. Really appreciate it.